I knew something was wrong before anyone said it. The table was already set, plates in place, but no one had started eating. My brother was sitting back in his chair like he was waiting for a moment he had practiced. He didn't take long. "We're putting Grandma's properties on the market and dividing everything." He said it plainly, like it had already been agreed to. Then he looked at me and added, "You get nothing." He didn't look away when he said it. Grandma knew who stayed, and who didn't. My mother nodded slowly. "You made your choices." Naomi, that was all. No explanation. No hesitation. I set my hand down on the table and asked, as evenly as I could, what authority they were acting under. The properties were held in a trust. I knew that much. I also knew my name was part of it. My brother didn't answer the question. He leaned forward and said they had been the ones managing everything since Grandma passed. My mother added that she was handling things now, that decisions had to be made quickly. "That doesn't give you the right to remove me," I said. They didn't argue. They didn't even try to justify it beyond what they had already said. That was when it settled in. This wasn't something they had just decided tonight. It had been discussed, agreed on, and brought to the table as a conclusion. I sat there for a moment longer, looking at both of them. I had expected disagreement, maybe even tension, but not this kind of certainty. I pushed my chair back and stood up. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. "I'll have someone review this," I said. It was the only thing that felt useful to say. I walked out without raising my voice. The hallway was quiet, and the front door closed behind me with a soft sound that carried more weight than anything said inside. Outside, the air was cool. I stood still for a moment, letting everything settle into place in my head. I wasn't surprised anymore, just clear. Halfway to my car, my phone buzzed in my hand. The phone kept buzzing in my hand before I even reached the car, and I answered it without checking the number because I already knew who it would be. "Naomi." "It's Daniel," my lawyer said, his voice steady in a way that made everything feel more real. "I need you to listen carefully." I leaned against the side of the car and let him talk. He told me he had received notice that a listing agreement had already been signed earlier that week for at least 2 of the properties, and that the realtor had been given instructions to move quickly. I closed my eyes for a moment. That meant tonight wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the part where they told me. "You're still a named beneficiary in the trust," he continued. "Nothing about that has changed. Your mother may be acting as trustee, but that role comes with fiduciary obligations. She can't selectively exclude you from decisions or proceeds." I asked him what that meant in practical terms, because I didn't need reassurance. I needed to know what could actually happen next. "It means they're moving into dangerous territory," he said. "If they proceed without full disclosure or attempt to distribute assets unevenly, that can be challenged. But timing matters. If they close a sale before we act, it complicates everything." I looked back toward the house. The lights were still on in the dining room, steady and unchanged, like nothing had shifted at all. "They're trying to move fast," I said. "Yes," he replied. "And that usually means they don't expect resistance." That landed harder than anything else he had said. We agreed to meet first thing in the morning to go through the trust documents in detail and prepare a response if needed. He didn't push me to decide anything on the spot, which I appreciated more than I expected. When the call ended, I stayed where I was for a minute longer. The situation hadn't exploded the way I thought it might. It had narrowed instead, into something defined and structured. I got into the car and set my phone on the seat beside me, already knowing that whatever came next wouldn't look anything like a family conversation anymore. I didn't drive right away. I sat in the car with the engine off, replaying the dinner in my head. Not the words themselves, but the way they had been delivered. My brother hadn't sounded angry. He had sounded pressed, like he was trying to move through something quickly before it could fall apart. That part stayed with me. I thought about the last time I had seen him outside of family gatherings. He had mentioned the business not doing as well as expected. Something about expansion costs and a loan he was still covering. At the time, I didn't ask for details. It hadn't felt like my place. Now it did. My mother was different. Since my grandmother passed, she had taken over everything without asking for input. It wasn't unusual for her to step in, but this felt more fixed than usual, like she wasn't willing to let anyone else share control. When she said I had left, it didn't land the way she probably expected. I had moved for work, built something on my own, stayed in contact in the ways that made sense. But in her version, distance had turned into absence. I could see how that story worked for them. It justified the decision before they even said it out loud. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and let that settle. It wasn't that they didn't know what they were doing. It was that they had already decided it was acceptable. That made it easier, in a way, to stop expecting anything else from them. Not because it didn't matter, but because it already had. By the next morning, I was sitting across from Daniel in his office, a stack of documents spread between us. He didn't rush the process. He moved page by page, marking sections, cross-checking dates, and occasionally pausing long enough for me to follow his reasoning. "The trust is straightforward," he said at one point, tapping the margin with his pen. "Equal beneficiaries. No discretionary clause that would allow exclusion." That part wasn't surprising. What came after was, we pulled up the records for the last 2 years, and it became clear that I had been the one covering property taxes on 2 of the properties, including the lake house and one of the downtown units. I remembered doing it because the notices had come to me directly, and no one else had stepped in. Daniel looked up. "Were you reimbursed for any of this?" "No," I said. "I didn't ask." He nodded, not as a judgment, but as a note. We moved on to rental income, and that's where the numbers stopped aligning. There were deposits missing from the reported totals, not large enough individually to raise alarms, but consistent enough to matter. It suggested either incomplete reporting or something that wasn't meant to be seen. I recognized one of the missing entries. It was from the downtown unit I had helped rent out myself. "This isn't enough on its own," Daniel said, "but it establishes a pattern. And patterns are what courts pay attention to." I leaned back slightly, taking it in. The tension I had felt the night before didn't disappear, but it shifted. It wasn't just about what had been said at dinner anymore. It was about what could be demonstrated. For the first time since I left the house, I felt like I was looking at something solid, something that didn't depend on how anyone chose to frame the story. After leaving Daniel's office, I sat in my car again, but this time I wasn't replaying the dinner. I was thinking about the last few months I had spent with my grandmother before she passed. Most of it had been quiet, practical things, sorting papers, organizing folders, making sure bills were being tracked correctly. She had been very clear about what she wanted, even when her energy was low. "Keep things simple," she told me one afternoon while we sat at the kitchen table. "Documents spread between us. No one should feel pushed out. That's how families break." I hadn't thought much about it at the time. It sounded like something she would say, something general and steady. But now, with everything laid out in front of me, it didn't feel general anymore. I remembered how she insisted on keeping copies of everything, how she asked me to double-check account numbers, how she made sure I understood where things were kept. She didn't explain why she chose me for that. She just trusted that I would handle it carefully. That memory didn't change the legal situation, but it changed how I saw my place in it. I wasn't someone who had drifted away and lost connection. I had been there when it mattered, just not in the way they measured. I sat there for a moment, letting that settle without trying to turn it into anything more. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about knowing that what I was protecting wasn't imagined. I picked up my phone to call my mother. I even scrolled to her name. Then I stopped. I already knew what she would say. She would tell me to let it go. I didn't give myself much time to sit with it after reviewing the documents. The longer I waited, the more space I gave them to keep moving, and I had already seen what that looked like. By the time I got home, I had made the decision. I called Daniel and told him to proceed, file the notice, request the accounting, and move forward with the injunction. I said, I don't want this handled informally anymore. He didn't argue or slow me down, but he did make sure I understood the shift. Once this is filed, everything changes, he said. You're no longer dealing with them as family. You're dealing with them as opposing parties. I understand, I replied. That already happened at dinner. There was a short pause on the line. Then he moved on to logistics. By the end of the call, everything was set in motion. The notice of dispute was filed that afternoon. It formally established that I was contesting any attempt to sell or distribute the trust assets without full transparency. At the same time, the request for a complete accounting went out, requiring a detailed record of every financial movement connected to the properties. Daniel also began preparing the filing for a temporary injunction, which would prevent any sale from going through until the situation was reviewed. He explained the timeline carefully, how quickly we needed to act, and what could happen if they tried to close before the court responded. I read through every document before it was submitted. The language was precise, almost impersonal, but that was the point. It didn't rely on interpretation. It didn't depend on anyone agreeing with me. It simply stated what I was entitled to and what they were required to provide. I didn't contact my mother or my brother. There wasn't anything left to say that would change the position they had already taken. I realized that conversation had stopped being useful the moment they decided to exclude me. That night, after everything was filed, I sat with my laptop open, rereading the confirmations. It didn't feel like escalation. It felt like a boundary that should have been there from the beginning, finally being made visible. I knew they would see it differently, probably as an attack or an overreaction. But from where I was sitting, it didn't feel like either of those things. It felt measured, deliberate, and necessary. Once it was done, there was no version of this that went back to what it had been before. They didn't slow down after the filings went through. If anything, they moved faster. Daniel forwarded me an update the next afternoon. My brother and mother had accepted a deposit from a buyer for one of the downtown units. The amount wasn't small, and the timeline they agreed to suggested they were trying to close before anything could formally stop them. They're accelerating, Daniel said over the phone. That usually means they think they still have room to push. Daniel paused. Their attorney may not have the full picture yet. I read through the documents he sent. The agreement was there, signed, but incomplete in a way that stood out once you knew where to look. There was no acknowledgement of my position as a beneficiary, no indication that the trust was under dispute. That won't hold. I said, No, he replied, but it creates exposure. For them, and for anyone involved. By the end of the day, the realtor reached out through Daniel's office. Her message was careful, almost cautious. She was asking for confirmation that the trustee had full authority to proceed without objection. Daniel handled the response. He didn't escalate. He didn't accuse. He simply provided the notice that had already been filed. After that, things went quiet, not resolved, just waiting. I didn't contact my family. I didn't respond to anything directly. There was nothing to add that hadn't already been set in motion. It was strange to watch it unfold like that, knowing where it would end but not interfering with the steps in between. They had chosen their direction, and now the process was catching up to it. I let it play out. The change didn't feel dramatic when it happened. It came through in a short message from Daniel early in the morning. The kind of message that doesn't try to sound important because it doesn't need to. Later that afternoon, my phone lit up again. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was my brother. What did you do? He said, his voice tight, like he was trying not to lose control. I stopped the sale. I replied. There was a long pause. Then he said, You didn't have to do it like this. I didn't answer right away. Neither did you. I read it once, then again. Not because it was unclear, but because everything attached to it moved quickly after that. Any pending sale activity had to stop. No closing, no transfer, no movement tied to the trust properties could continue until the review was complete. By late morning, Daniel forwarded me a notice from the realtor. She was stepping away from the transaction until authority was fully confirmed. The wording was careful, distant, and final enough to signal that she didn't want to be connected to whatever came next. The buyer followed shortly after, withdrawing without delay. There was no attempt to renegotiate or wait it out. Daniel called me that afternoon. Their attorney has requested time to review the filings, he said. They're aware there's exposure now. I understood what that meant. The issue had moved beyond a disagreement about distribution. It was now about whether the decisions that had already been made could stand up under scrutiny. Once the accounting process began, the details we had identified earlier started to carry more weight. The missing rental entries, the tax payments I had covered, the lack of disclosure across multiple transactions, it all had to be addressed in a way that couldn't be avoided or explained away casually. I didn't attend the first review, but Daniel kept me informed. The tone had shifted. There were fewer statements of certainty coming from their side, more revisions, more attempts to correct what had already been put forward. At this stage, they're not pushing, he said. They're responding. That distinction mattered. I sat at my desk later that evening, the confirmation of the injunction open in front of me. It didn't feel like a win. It felt like something had settled into place, something that no longer depended on who spoke louder or decided first. For the first time since that night, I wasn't reacting to what they were doing. They were adjusting to what had already been set in motion. The outcome didn't arrive all at once. It came through in a series of formal updates, each one narrowing what my mother and brother could still claim. The court approved the appointment of an independent trustee within the week. My mother's authority was removed without much room for argument. The reasoning was written plainly in the notice failure to meet fiduciary obligations, lack of full disclosure, and actions that created risk to the trust. Daniel called me after it was finalized. This changes the structure entirely, he said. Decisions will now go through a neutral party. I understood what that meant. Control had shifted, and it wasn't coming back. The accounting process followed through on what we had already seen. My brother was required to return funds that had been taken from rental income without proper reporting. The number wasn't overwhelming on its own, but it was enough to establish a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Daniel told me my brother hadn't argued the number. He signed it, he said. That told me he understood what it meant. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That told me more than anything else. The deposit they had accepted was lost. The buyer had withdrawn as soon as the injunction went into effect, and there was no legal ground to keep the funds. Legal fees were assessed against the trust and then allocated proportionally. But a larger share was assigned to my mother and brother due to the circumstances that led to the dispute. It was all documented, calculated, and signed off without discussion. After that, communication became minimal. Emails replaced calls, and anything that needed to be said was said through attorneys or the trustee. I didn't hear from my mother directly. My brother sent one message, brief and uneven, asking if there was any way to resolve things privately. I let Daniel respond on my behalf. By then, there wasn't anything left to negotiate. The process had already settled into its conclusion, and it didn't require anything from me beyond staying consistent. The final transfer didn't feel like a moment worth marking. It came through as a confirmation email, followed by a set of documents I reviewed and signed without hesitation. My share was clear, separated, and no longer tied to anything that required agreement from anyone else. I chose to separate everything completely. There were options to stay partially connected, to keep certain properties under shared structure, but I didn't consider them for long. I had already seen how quickly shared control turned into selective control. I realized I didn't need to prove I could stay. I just needed to decide I didn't have to. A few days later, I drove out to the lake house before finalizing the last step. The place looked unchanged from the outside. The gravel driveway, the quiet water beyond the trees. All of it exactly where it had always been. Inside, it felt smaller. Not because anything had shifted physically, but because I was no longer looking at it the same way. I walked through the rooms slowly, not searching for anything in particular, There wasn't anything left to collect or reclaim. What mattered had already been settled somewhere else, in decisions that didn't depend on this space. I didn't call my mother. I didn't reach out to my brother. That part didn't require a final conversation. It had already moved past that point. My phone stayed silent the whole drive back. I realized I wasn't waiting for it to ring anymore. On the drive back, I thought about the way they had framed everything that night, how easily they had reduced distance to absence and independence to disloyalty. It didn't hold anymore. It didn't need to. If there's anything I've learned from this, it's that you can't rely on shared history to protect you when the terms change without your consent. You have to recognize when something stops being mutual and starts being managed. I went back to my routine after that. Work, small decisions, things that stayed within my control. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt steady. I wasn't walking away from family. I was finally walking toward myself.